imagine a king, right, in the ancient Middle East.
Uh,
And he's walking barefoot through the severed, bloody halves of dead animals.
yeah, it's a completely terrifying ritual.
Exactly. It's a literal death vow. Because in the ancient world, if you made a treaty, you didn't just, sign a piece of paper.
Right.
You walk through this blood path to basically say, may I be torn apart just like these animals if I break my promise.
Which is heavy.
So heavy. But in the most important version of this ritual in all of human history,
Mm-hmm.
the human being involved is fast asleep.
Yes.
He's passed out. And the creator of the universe, appearing as this terrifying smoking fire, is walking through the blood all by himself.
It is one of the most staggering, bizarre, and profoundly beautiful scenes in all of ancient literature.
Oh, for sure.
And it completely rewrites the rules of how humanity relates to the divine.
It really does. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking how this single surreal night under the stars basically defined the concept of faith for billions of people.
Yeah, and if you're joining us, you should know we've got a fascinating stack of sources to go through today.
We really do.
It's all centered around this really comprehensive theological analysis by Chris R. Velazquez, along with some incredibly detailed historical and theological infographics.
Right. And our entire mission today, for you listening, is to drill down into one world-changing concept. The title is Faith and Righteousness. Abraham believes God's promises.
Exactly. We are going to be exploring what is, arguably, the fountainhead of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Specifically, we'll be circling around a single sentence from the ancient text of Genesis. It's Genesis 15.6, which reads, "And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness."
Now, if you are listening to this on your commute or, while walking the dog, you might hear that and think, okay, an ancient religious text.
Right, here we go.
Yeah, probably about a guy who was morally flawless, wore a metaphorical cape, and just soared above the clouds of human weakness.
Which is such a common misconception.
It is. We have this tendency to view historical biblical figures as, like, glossy superheroes.
Oh, absolutely.
We read their origin stories and just assume they never had a moment of crippling doubt.
Exactly. It's a very comforting way to frame history, right?
Right.
We want our historical figures categorized neatly as the good guys whose trust never wavered.
Right.
But when you actually engage with the source material, that glossy comic book page is just instantly torn to shreds.
And that's what I found so compelling about this analysis.
Yeah.
Because it points out that the guy known universally as the, quote, father of faith was not perfect.
Not even close.
Right. His life was intensely human,
Yeah.
messy, marked by fear, delay, weakness.
Partial obedience.
Yes, partial obedience. And moments where he actively tried to manipulate outcomes because he just didn't trust what was happening.
It is the absolute definition of complicated.
Yeah.
But the texts we are reviewing make a really crucial point here. This complexity isn't a flaw in the narrative. It is the entire point of the narrative. Abraham matters historically and theologically, not because he was a superhero, but because he stands right at the intersection of human brokenness and divine initiative.
So for you, the listener, I think the best way to frame this is to just drop the superhero analogy entirely.
Good call.
Yeah. Instead, think of Abraham more like an ordinary person stumbling through a pitch black room.
I like that.
He doesn't have a map. He certainly doesn't have, like, night vision goggles.
Mm-hmm.
All he has is a single flashlight.
Right.
And that flashlight is God's promise.
Right.
And as we all know, a flashlight doesn't illuminate the whole room. It only illuminates the very next step in front of you.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it, because he teaches us that righteousness, which, by the way, is a concept we are going to define very deeply today.
Oh, yeah, we're getting into that.
Righteousness is not earned by some flawless spiritual performance. It is received through trust in the one who speaks, even when you are just, following that narrow beam of light in the dark.
But to really understand why Abraham's flashlight was so revolutionary, we first have to look at how incredibly dark the room was before he ever turned it on.
Yes.
Because you can't understand the cure until you understand the disease.
Exactly.
And our sources take us back to the state of the world long before Abraham even enters the stage.
Yeah.
We're talking about the pre-Abrahamic world.
Yeah, the biblical narrative doesn't introduce Abraham into a neutral vacuum.
Right.
He enters a world that is already deeply wounded. The infographics we're looking at map this out really clearly. They trace the story from creation to the fall to the flood and finally to the Tower of Babel.
So let's walk through that sequence because the contrast is stark. You start with Genesis 1 and 2, which is creation.
Right, the beginning.
And this is described as a good world under God's rule. Humanity is blessed. There's beauty, order, and covenantal responsibility. Everything is functioning exactly as it was designed to.
But that harmony is shattered almost immediately.
It doesn't last long.
No. In Genesis 3, we see the fall. And the text points out this isn't just a story about eating a piece of fruit.
Right.
It's a narrative about the rupture of trust.
Yep.
Human beings basically reject divine authority in search of total autonomy. They want to define good and evil for themselves.
And the sociological and theological result of that is alienation on every conceivable level.
Exactly.
I mean, they are alienated from God, from each other, and literally from the earth itself.
And once that trust is broken, society spirals fast.
Oh, incredibly fast. By Genesis 6 through 9, we hit the flood.
Yeah.
And the sources bluntly state that the earth is filled with corruption and violence. God preserves Noah purely by mercy, effectively hitting like a cosmic reset button.
But humanity doesn't learn its lesson.
No, they don't.
Which brings us to a massive pivotal moment in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel.
Babel is fascinating.
It's a critical juncture for understanding everything that follows. Because by Genesis 11, human rebellion isn't just an individual problem anymore.
Right, it's scaled up.
Yes, it has become civilizational. Humanity gathers together to build this massive tower, a ziggurat. And their stated goal in Genesis 11.4 is fascinating. They say, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.
Let us make a name for ourselves. That really jumps out to me.
It's the core issue.
If we put that into modern terms, they're essentially trying to build a civilizational personal brand.
Oh, absolutely.
It's the ultimate human bootstrap effort. They want legacy, status, security, and they want to achieve it purely through their own engineering and ambition.
Exactly. It is an act of supreme pride and self-exaltation. Because in the ancient world, a ziggurat wasn't just a tall building.
Right, it wasn't just ancient skyscrapers.
No, it was a piece of religious technology. It was literally designed as a stairway for the gods to come down so that humans could feed them, appease them, and ultimately, manipulate them. They are actively resisting God's command to spread out and fill the earth, choosing instead to consolidate power.
And it's driven entirely by fear, lest we be dispersed.
Yeah.
They think if they don't hustle enough, if they don't build this monument to their own greatness, they will just be lost to history.
Which is such a modern fear.
It really is. It's an obsession with legacy that perfectly mirrors modern culture's obsession with career status and online clout.
Totally.
So God scatters the nations, he confuses their languages, and the analysis calls this scattering both a judgment on their pride and a mercy to prevent them from destroying themselves with consolidated power.
Right. But here is the massive theological contrast our sources highlight.
Okay.
At Babel, humanity says, let us make a name for ourselves. Immediately after that, in the very next chapter, Genesis 12, God speaks to one obscure man named Abraham. Right. And God says, I will make your name great.
Okay, that juxtaposition is staggering.
Isn't it?
Human pride at Babel sought a tower to secure its own identity, trying to reach up to the heavens through sheer human effort and hustle. And God's response isn't to build a better tower.
No.
His response is to just talk to one guy.
Precisely. The sequencing is highly intentional. Babel represents civilizational rebellion and the total futility of trying to climb up to God.
Yeah.
Abraham's appearance right after this represents divine initiative. It is God reaching down through grace. When the entire globe goes into rebellion, God responds by initiating a covenant based entirely on a promise.
Okay, but I have to push back on this on behalf of the listener.
Sure.
Because this is where a lot of modern readers get really uncomfortable. God scatters the entire globe in Genesis 11 as a judgment.
Right.
But then he turns around and just picks one guy, one family, in Genesis 12. Isn't that just replacing a massive global problem with a tribal exclusive club? Like, why play favorites with humanity?
It's a very natural question and a deeply important one, but the sources we're reviewing are adamant that this is a misreading of the text. Yeah. Abraham does not become the answer to Babel because he is morally superior or genetically special. God doesn't pick him to create an exclusive club.
Okay.
The covenant with Abraham is not a tribal closure. The analysis explicitly calls it a redemptive opening.
A redemptive opening. Explain how that works practically.
Think of it this way. God elects one man and one family, yes, but for the ultimate sake of the nations.
Right.
The very promise God gives to Abraham in Genesis 12 ends with the phrase, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." The particular choice of one man has a universal horizon. The goal was always the entire globe.
It makes me think of a medical scenario.
Oh, how so?
Imagine a doctor walking into a hospital where a deadly global pandemic has infected everyone.
Okay.
The doctor doesn't try to treat all 8 billion people simultaneously with a superficial Band-Aid.
Yeah.
Instead, the doctor isolates a single cell.
Yes.
They put all their focus, all their resources into working on that one cell. Not to hoard it, not because that cell is fundamentally better than the others, but to create a vaccine.
Exactly.
And once that vaccine is perfected in the isolated cell, it is distributed to cure the entire world.
That is a highly effective analogy. The calling of Abraham is the isolation of that cell. The promise is the vaccine.
Wow.
And how does God initiate this relationship? As the text emphasizes, he doesn't hand Abraham a blueprint or a philosophy textbook or a strategic 10-year plan.
Right, no PowerPoint presentation.
None of that. He hands him a command and a promise.
Which brings us to Genesis 12, the call. God commands Abram to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house.
Yeah.
And it's vital to understand what that actually meant back then. It wasn't like moving from Chicago to Denver for a new job.
Not at all. Historically, Abram lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, which was a thriving, advanced Mesopotamian metropolis.
Right.
It had complex commerce, massive ziggurats, and a really high standard of living for the ancient world. God is essentially calling him out of the ancient equivalent of Manhattan and telling him to become a nomad in the desert.
And the vulnerability of that is just wild. Leaving your father's house in the ancient Near East meant leaving your primary source of physical protection,
Yes, your economic stability.
your social identity.
Mhm.
It's like cutting up your passport, emptying your bank account, and walking out of a fortified city into a wilderness filled with hostile tribes with absolutely zero armor.
Exactly.
And where exactly is he supposed to go?
Well, the text says, "To the land that I will show you." That is the exact phrasing.
That I will show you.
Right. What's fascinating here is the order of operations. God does not explain the destination first. The land is a real physical place, but to Abram, the future remains entirely unseen.
Wow.
The paper states this beautifully. Faith begins where sight ends.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Abram is basically handed a plane ticket with no destination printed on it.
Right.
It's just a promise from the pilot it's going to be a great trip.
Yeah.
And along with this blank ticket, God dismantles every earthly safety net Abram has.
Every single one.
But in exchange, God offers what the author calls a cascade of promises.
Let's look at how the infographics break down these promises because they fall into 4 distinct categories.
Okay, lay it out, boys.
First, land, a place of inheritance and survival, replacing what he left in Ur.
Right.
Second, nation and offspring, a great people through whom God's plan will unfold, replacing his extended family.
Makes sense.
Third, blessing and a name. God promises to give him honor and a great name. And notice the direct contrast to Babel here.
Oh, where humanity tried to make a name for themselves.
Exactly. Here, God says, "I will make your name great."
It's the difference between seizing status and receiving it as a gift.
Exactly. And the fourth category is the global blessing. Through him, all families of the earth shall be blessed. The isolated cell becomes the cure.
It's a staggering amount of promise for one guy holding a blank plane ticket.
It really is.
And the analysis maps out this journey visually as a cycle, what they call the journey of faith. It has these distinct phases: hear, believe, obey, worship, wait, and bless.
It's a profound cycle. It starts with hear, God initiates by speaking.
Right.
Then believe, Abram trusts the promise. Then obey, he physically steps out. Genesis 12.4 says he went as the Lord had told him.
So it's not just a feeling.
No, the text is making a point here. Biblical faith is never passive resignation. It is active trust. His physical movement out of Ur is the outward form of his inward confidence.
He builds altars of remembrance along the way, too, which is the worship phase.
Yes.
He's marking the ground, saying, God spoke to me here.
Mm-hmm.
But then we hit the phase that I think breaks most people.
Oh, the waiting.
Wait. She has to wait patiently for the fulfillment. And I want to camp out here for a second because this is where the rubber meets the road for anyone listening today.
Absolutely.
We live in a culture that absolutely despises waiting. Everything is optimized for instant delivery.
We are entirely conditioned for immediate gratification. I mean, if an app takes 4 seconds to load, we close it.
Right.
If we don't see results instantly in our careers or relationships, we assume something is fundamentally broken.
And how often do we interpret delay as denial?
all the time.
If the promotion doesn't happen, if the medical healing doesn't come immediately, if we are stuck in a holding pattern, we think the promise is void. We think God has forgotten.
Right.
But Abraham lives decades, literally decades, between receiving the promise of offspring and seeing the fulfillment of that promise.
And he is aging.
Yes, his wife Sarah is aging far past childbearing years. The biological window isn't just closing, it is slamming shut.
The paper addresses this tension directly in its practical implications. It says Abraham lived for decades in the agonizing space between what God said and what his circumstances actually showed.
Wow.
Faith does not deny the tension, it endures it. Waiting is not passive, it is trust stretched over time.
Trust stretched over time. That is a phenomenal phrase. His faith wasn't a sudden magical burst of instant maturity.
No.
It was a muscle being torn and rebuilt over years in the desert. And this stretching over time eventually brings Abram to a breaking point.
It does.
A moment of deep, honest, almost desperate questioning, which leads us perfectly into Genesis 15, the absolute hinge of history.
Genesis 15 is the theological epicenter of Abraham's story. Despite all the grand promises, years have passed and Abram is still childless.
Right.
The promises remain entirely unfulfilled in any visible, tangible way. So he finally asks God a very urgent, raw question. "Oh, Lord God, what will you give me for I continue childless?"
And I appreciate that the paper points out this isn't hostile unbelief.
No, not at all.
It's not a rejection of God. It's just the honest, unfiltered speech of a man who is standing right in the middle of that tension between a massive, universe-altering promise and an empty cradle.
And God's response to this moment of vulnerability is incredibly poetic and profound. He doesn't scold Abram.
Right.
He brings him outside into the night and says, "Look toward heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them, so shall your offspring be."
And we get the foundational text of this entire deep dive, Genesis 15.6. And he believed the Lord and he counted it to him as righteousness.
This single verse is one of the great hinges of human thought. The author states its significance is impossible to exaggerate because it establishes the blueprint for how humanity can ever be right with a holy God.
Okay, so to truly grasp why, we need to break down the 4 key pillars of this verse organically.
Let's do it.
So when the text says he believed, it's not just that he believed God existed, right? I mean, even the builders of Babel believed God existed. They were trying to build a tower to reach him.
Exactly.
So Abraham's belief has to be a fundamentally different kind of belief.
That is the first crucial pillar, the object of his faith. The object isn't a philosophy. The object of his faith is the Lord himself.
Okay.
Abram didn't merely believe God's words in some abstract intellectual sense, the way you might believe a mathematical formula is true. He believed God, the person.
It's relational.
Yes, relational trust grounded in divine character.
Yeah.
He trusts the promiser, not just the promise.
Okay, so we trust the person of God. But what about the second part? And he counted it to him as righteousness.
Right.
This word righteousness gets thrown around a lot, usually meaning moral perfection. But at this point in the story, Abram isn't morally flawless.
Far from it. And that is the second pillar, the basis of righteousness. This is critical for you, the listener, to catch. At this exact moment in the narrative, Abram is not perfect.
No.
The 10 Commandments haven't been given yet. The law literally doesn't exist. He hasn't even engaged in any of the physical religious rituals yet.
Right.
The verdict that he is righteous, meaning in right standing with God, comes completely prior to all of those religious frameworks.
Which flows right into the mechanism of how this works. The third pillar, the verb, righteousness is counted.
Exactly. It is counted, credited, reckoned. It is not achieved, generated, or earned by Abram's sweat.
Wow.
The language here is judicial, accounting language. God credits righteousness to Abram purely on the basis of his faith. This is the very seed of the doctrine of justification by faith.
Okay, so think of this like a cosmic accounting ledger.
I love this analogy.
Imagine you were looking at Abraham's spiritual financial books, but instead of dollars and cents, the currency is moral perfection righteousness.
Okay.
Abraham's ledger has a massive zero balance in the righteousness column. He hasn't earned anything. He has no spiritual capital to his name.
Right.
But instead of God waiting for Abraham to start making deposits of good deeds, hustling to fill up the account, God simply transfers his own infinite wealth into Abraham's account. Why? Simply because Abraham opened his empty hands and trusted him.
That accounting analogy is incredibly accurate to how the Apostle Paul later interprets this exact verse in the New Testament book of Romans.
Really?
Yes. Abraham's faith wasn't a currency he used to buy righteousness. Faith was merely the empty hands that received it. And that brings us to the fourth pillar the analysis highlights, the theater of grace.
The theater of grace. What does the paper mean by that phrasing?
Well, the immediate promise God is making concerns offspring, right? The stars in the sky. But the deeper underlying issue being resolved is about humans standing before God. Abraham's physical childlessness isn't just a biological problem. It becomes a theater, a stage, where divine grace is put on display.
Oh, I see.
God gives righteousness to a man who can neither earn it morally nor produce the promised future biologically. He is utterly, helplessly dependent.
And what happens next is where things get truly wild. God doesn't just leave it at a verbal promise.
No, he doesn't.
He seals this dependence with a covenant ceremony right after this verse in the second half of Genesis 15. This goes back to the terrifying ancient ritual we talked about in the very beginning of the show.
Yes. Abram asks for a sign, a guarantee that he will inherit the land, and God tells Abram to bring a heifer, a female goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon.
Okay.
Abram cuts the animals in half and lays the pieces opposite each other, creating a path between the bloody carcasses.
As you said earlier, in the ancient Near East, this was a highly recognizable, deeply serious legal custom.
A self-maledictory oath.
Right. Kings making treaties, called suzerain vassal treaties. But there's a massive twist here, isn't there? Normally, in the ancient world, the lesser king, the vassal, is the one who has to walk through the blood, saying, if I break this treaty, let me be torn apart like these animals.
Exactly. And the great king just sits on his throne and watches.
Right. But that's not what happens.
No, that is the staggering cosmic reversal of Genesis 15. The sun goes down and a terrifying darkness falls upon Abram. God puts him into a deep sleep.
Wow.
Abram is entirely incapacitated. He cannot walk the path. And then God alone, symbolized by a smoking firepot and a flaming torch, passes between the severed pieces of the animals.
It gives me chills just thinking about the implications of that. The creator of the universe is taking the place of the lesser king. God is making a one-sided commitment.
Yes. God is binding himself to the promise with solemn self-commitment. The analysis explains that God is essentially saying, may I be torn apart, may I cease to be God if I fail to keep my end of this promise.
That is heavy.
The covenant rests ultimately on divine faithfulness, not on Abram's capacity to perfectly obey. God takes the curse upon himself if the covenant fails.
That completely shifts the weight of the universe off of Abraham's shoulders. The ledger is full. The treaty is signed in blood by God alone.
Exactly.
But this raises a huge immediate question.
Okay.
If Abraham's account is credited perfectly and completely in Genesis 15, based on faith alone, why does God show up years later demanding a painful physical religious ritual? I'm talking about Genesis 17, where God introduces circumcision. Doesn't that contradict the whole faith alone idea?
Yeah.
We go from this beautiful, grace-filled cosmic accounting to a strict physical demand.
It's a brilliant question, and it was the source of massive theological controversy in the early centuries of the faith. Genesis 17 is where God institutes circumcision for Abraham and his household.
Right.
It's also where his name is officially changed from Abram to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude. But you're right, it creates friction. If he is already righteous, why add a physical requirement?
Right. It feels like God is saying, okay, you're righteous by faith, but also you need to do this physical work just to be sure.
This is where the timeline of the text becomes absolutely critical to everything. The sources emphasize this timeline rigorously. Promise, then faith, then righteousness, and then the sign.
Okay, the order matters.
Immensely. The sign circumcision comes years after Genesis 15. It follows the word received in faith. It does not cause the righteousness. It acts as a marker, a seal of the covenant belonging that already exists.
So it's like a wedding ring.
Yes, exactly.
Putting on a wedding ring doesn't make you married. You could go to a jewelry store today, buy a ring, and put it on your finger. Doesn't manifest a spouse.
Right. You're just wearing jewelry.
The vows, the internal commitment, the mutual trust, that is the covenant that makes you married. The ring is just the visible sign, the outward proof to the rest of the world that the inward commitment exists. You don't wear the ring to become married, you wear it because you are married.
That analogy perfectly captures it. And it bridges the gap to why the Apostle Paul spends so much time on this in the book of Romans.
How so?
Paul bases his entire argument for Gentile inclusion on this very timeline. He points out that Abraham was justified before he was circumcised.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, mathematically and theologically, Abraham is the father of all believers, both those who possess the physical sign of circumcision, the Jewish people, and those who do not, the Gentiles.
As long as they share the exact same faith he had while he was still uncircumcised.
Exactly.
That is a masterstroke of theological logic. But we have to address the elephant in the room regarding the New Testament writers, because it feels like they're in a fistfight over this.
The James and Paul issue.
Yes. The Apostle Paul says in Romans 4 that a person is justified by faith apart from works. But the Apostle James writes in James chapter 2 that Abraham was justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar, and that faith without works is dead.
Right.
If you just read those two sentences side by side, it looks like a complete contradiction.
They do appear contradictory at first glance, and skeptics have pointed to this for centuries. But the paper untangles this beautifully by looking at the distinct contexts of their audiences.
Okay.
It argues that Paul and James are actually answering two completely different questions.
Okay, break that down for us. What is Paul answering?
Paul is dealing with people who think they can earn God's favor by keeping the law. So Paul is answering the question, how does a sinner get declared right before a holy God?
Right.
And his answer is Genesis 15, by faith alone. He is talking about the root of salvation, the invisible transaction where the accounting ledger is filled.
And what is James answering?
James is dealing with a totally different crowd. He's writing to people who claim to have faith, but their lives are a moral disaster.
Ah, I see.
They are ignoring the poor, showing favoritism, living selfishly. They are treating faith as just intellectual agreement. So James is answering the question, how do we know if a person's invisible faith is actually genuine?
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right, and his answer is that true faith is vindicated or made visible through action. He's talking about the fruit.
Ah, the root versus the fruit. Works do not produce saving faith, but living faith produces works. That is a mic drop sentence from the source text.
It really is.
True faith, the kind that actually saves, is not dead mental agreement. You don't just sit in a chair and say, I believe the chair can hold me. You sit in it.
Exactly.
Your action proves your belief. Abraham believed God in Genesis 15, and that invisible faith became undeniable, visible, terrifying action in Genesis 22.
Which brings us to arguably the most intense, chilling, and profound narrative in all of literature, Genesis 22, the ultimate test.
Yeah, we need to linger on this because this is where a lot of modern readers completely tap out.
Understandably.
In Genesis 22, God asks Abraham to take his son, Isaac, the very son of the promise, the one he waited decades for, the one whose birth was a biological miracle, and offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain in Moriah.
It's devastating.
I have to be completely honest. As a modern reader, and I know for many of you listening right now, this story is incredibly hard to stomach.
Yes.
How on earth does a listener reconcile the idea of a good, loving, just God asking a father to tie up his own child and sacrifice him? It sounds like psychological torture. It sounds like ancient barbarism.
It is deeply unsettling. And the biblical text does not shy away from the severity of it. It doesn't soften the blow at all.
Right.
The paper we're analyzing calls this a severe mercy. The key to understanding it is that this request is not divine cruelty, nor is it ancient barbarism, because God's intent was never to actually let Isaac die.
Okay.
The event is divine revelation. It is an excruciating crucible designed to expose the ultimate priority of Abraham's heart.
Expose it how? What is actually being tested?
The question at the core of the universe. Does Abraham trust the giver more than the gift?
Wow.
Isaac was the fulfillment of everything Abraham ever wanted. It is incredibly easy, humanly speaking, to turn the blessing of God into an idol that replaces God.
Right, because he waited so long for him.
Exactly. God is testing whether Abraham's faith is in the comfort of the promise or in the character of the promiser.
But the trauma of that. He obeys, he saddles the donkey, he takes the 3-day journey.
Yeah.
And there is this heartbreaking, devastatingly quiet moment where Isaac, who is likely a young man at this point, is carrying the wood up the mountain. He looks around and says, Father, here's the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?
It's a gut-wrenching question.
I cannot imagine the lump in Abraham's throat in that moment. And Abraham responds with a sentence that essentially defines the rest of the Bible. God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.
God will provide. The paper highlights that this statement reveals the internal logic of biblical faith. God provides what he requires.
Right.
And in the narrative, God does exactly that. They reach the top. Abraham builds the altar. He binds his son. He He raises the knife, and at the very last possible millisecond, the angel of the Lord calls out from heaven and stops him. And Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught in a nearby thicket by its horns. God provided the substitute.
But wait, I want to dig deeper into the mechanism of Abraham's mind here. Even if it gets stopped at the last second, she still had to raise the knife.
Right.
Was it just blind robotic obedience? Was he just emotionally detached? How does the paper justify his psychological state?
It wasn't blind and it wasn't robotic. The author brings in a New Testament commentary, Hebrews chapter 11, to explain the profound psychology of Abraham in this moment.
Okay, what does Hebrews say?
Hebrews says that Abraham reasoned that God was able even to raise someone from the dead.
Wait, really? He believed in resurrection, before resurrection was even a widely established theological concept.
Yes, his faith was not a leap into irrationality. It was absolute, calculated confidence in God's power and character, even when the promise appeared to be under lethal threat.
So he was doing the math.
Exactly. Abraham essentially did the math. God promised that the world would be blessed through Isaac. God cannot lie. Therefore, if God is telling me to sacrifice Isaac, God must be planning to resurrect Isaac from the ashes.
That is mind-blowing.
He trusted the promise so completely that he believed death itself was not an obstacle for God.
That is next-level, paradigm-shattering trust. And the paper makes a crucial theological connection here that bridges the ancient world to the New Testament.
It does.
It notes that this near sacrifice of Isaac heavily foreshadows the concept of substitutionary atonement.
Precisely. Isaac is spared because a substitute, the ram, is provided in the thicket. Fast forward a couple of millennia to a hill very close to this exact spot.
Right.
Humanity is spared because a substitute is provided on a Roman cross.
The ultimate lamb.
Okay.
God doesn't demand a sacrifice from humanity that he is unwilling to make himself. He eventually provides his own son so that humanity wouldn't have to face the ultimate penalty.
Which is the core of the Christian message.
And this shows us that Abraham's story isn't just an isolated incident of ancient faith. It is a single, vital thread woven into a massive cosmic tapestry.
Absolutely.
And that is the perfect pivot, because we need to zoom out. We've been looking very closely at the microscopic details of Abraham's life, his fears, his psychology, but now let's look at the macro view.
The big picture.
Let's look at the grand architecture of the sources. The infographics provide a stunning 12-stage timeline of the entire biblical narrative.
Let's walk through that grand narrative because it shows how the promise given under the stars to one obscure nomad expands to cover the entire universe.
Let's do it. Stage 1.
Stage 1 is eternity. Before Abraham ever existed, before the stars he counted were even formed, God purposed redemption. The covenant isn't an improvised reaction to human failure. It reveals what was always in Abraham's heart.
Stage 2 is creation. A good order, designed for humanity to live in trustful dependence on God. No need for a ledger because there was no debt.
Right. But then, stage 3, the fall. Sin brings rebellion, separation, and death. And this sets up exactly why we need a righteousness that is counted to us, rather than earned by us, because our ability to earn it was permanently shattered in Eden.
Which leads to stage 4, the covenant. God calls Abraham out of Ur. This is the turning point of the entire Bible.
It really is.
The promise of land, offspring, and global blessing is planted in the soil of history as a tiny seed.
Stage 5 is redemption. God delivers Israel from slavery in Egypt. And he doesn't do this randomly. The text in Exodus specifically says God delivered them because he remembered his covenant with Abraham.
The promise survives the centuries. Stage 6 is the kingdom. The promise narrows into the royal line of King David, pointing toward a coming king who will rule the nations with justice.
But humanity fails again. The kings become corrupt. The people turn to idolatry, bringing us to stage 7, exile. They lose the land.
And I want to pause on this because ancient exile felt like cosmic abandonment. It felt like God had shredded the treaty. But the promise remains intact, even in the darkness of Babylon.
Exactly. And that faithfulness leads to stage 8, restoration. God brings a remnant of the people back to the land and renews his promises, setting the stage for the climax of history.
Stage 9, the Messiah. Jesus of Nazareth arrives. And the paper quotes Galatians 3 here, which is vital.
Very important.
Paul argues that Jesus is the true seed of Abraham. All the promises made to Abraham find their ultimate fulfillment in Christ.
This completely reframes how you read the Bible. If you grew up in church, or even if you just know cultural references, it's so easy to view the Bible as a collection of disconnected, moralistic Sunday school stories.
Oh, totally. David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, Noah's Ark.
Right. But it's not a disjointed anthology. It is a single, continuous family tree grown from that one moment of trust under the stars in Genesis 15.
That's the exact right way to view it. The paper points out that in Galatians 3, Paul makes a radical claim. He writes that the gospel, the good news of salvation, was actually preached beforehand to Abraham when God said, "In you shall all nations be blessed."
It's mind-blowing.
The gospel isn't a New Testament invention that God came up with after the Old Testament failed. It was the plan all along.
Which brings us to stage 10, the church. The infographics describe the church as the multinational family of Abraham by faith.
Right.
It's not about ethnicity. It's not about biological bloodlines. It's about breaking down the dividing walls between Jews and Gentiles, uniting people from every tribe and language who share that exact same faith Abraham had.
Stage 11 is judgment. This is the final accountability where all counterfeit forms of trust are exposed. The towers of Babel are all brought down.
And finally, stage 12, new creation. The promise of inheritance expands far beyond a patch of ancient land in the Middle East.
Yeah.
The land promised to Abraham ultimately becomes a renewed earth, a healed cosmos where God dwells with his people forever.
The infographic has a brilliant comparison chart called Abraham Then and Now that really drives this home.
I love this chart.
Then it was one man in the city of Ur called by God. Now it is a multitude of people from every nation united by faith.
Right.
Then it was a promise of physical offspring, Isaac. Now it is spiritual offspring, all who believe in Christ. Then it was a promise of a physical land to possess. Now it is a heavenly inheritance, a new earth.
It's a huge shift.
Then he was meant to be a blessing to the surrounding ancient nations. Now the gospel is reaching the absolute ends of the earth.
It is a breathtaking expansion of scale, from one man's empty tent to a renewed cosmos.
Yeah.
But having synthesized all of this grand theology, this raises an incredibly important question. If we just leave it at the cosmic level, floating in the clouds of theological theory, we miss the point.
Definitely.
How does this ancient theology actually change the way a person lives their life on a daily basis?
That is the million-dollar question. Understanding the cosmic narrative is awe-inspiring, but how does this change the way you, the listener, operate on a random Tuesday morning?
Right.
When you're stuck in traffic or dealing with a toxic boss or facing a sudden health crisis? What does the doctrine of justification by faith have to do with paying your mortgage?
Our sources are very intentional about grounding this high theology in practical reality. They outline several key areas where this hits the pavement, starting with assurance.
I think assurance is something almost everyone struggles with, regardless of their background.
Oh, absolutely.
We are constantly asking, am I doing enough?
Yeah.
Am I good enough? Have I ruined my chances?
The doctrine of counted righteousness destroys that anxiety. Believers do not stand before God on the basis of their fluctuating daily performance. They stand on God's declared verdict in Christ.
Wow.
You are counted righteous by faith. It protects against the crushing weight of despair. The weak believer is not excluded because they are weak.
God justifies the ungodly. The paper explicitly says, He doesn't wait until you become godly enough to qualify for His grace.
Yes.
If you're listening to this and feeling overwhelmed by your own failures, if you're acutely aware of how far short you fall of perfection, this doctrine is your anchor. You don't have to clean yourself up before you can trust Him. You come with empty hands.
The paper also applies this powerfully to ministry and leadership.
How so?
Leaders are reminded that divine calling often begins in deep uncertainty, just like Abraham's blank plane ticket. Leadership shouldn't be built on self-confidence, hustle, or self-promotion.
Which, as we discussed, is the exact logic of Babel.
Exactly. It must be built on obedience to revelation. You lead as a servant of the promise, not as a seeker of personal prestige.
And discipleship. If you are a parent, a mentor, or leading anyone, the goal isn't just behavioral modification. It's not just handing someone a list of rules and saying, do better.
No, not at all.
The paper says discipleship is training people to believe God's promises more deeply than their fears. We cultivate trust. We help people read their own messy, chaotic lives through the lens of God's unshakable promises.
And in the mundane realities of daily life, this changes your entire posture. The world constantly promises you that if you just have enough control, enough financial status, or if you define your personal brand loudly enough, you'll finally be secure.
Right.
But Scripture calls us to live by a better promise. When you do that, your daily work isn't just a grind, it becomes an act of worship.
That's beautiful.
Suffering, which is inevitable, becomes bearable because it's placed under an overarching promise of redemption. Even profound disappointment, like Abraham waiting decades for a child, becomes a school where God teaches your soul to rest entirely in his word.
But the author also warns us about the pitfalls, because human nature is incredibly skilled at twisting grace into something else entirely. There are common misunderstandings that can completely derail this. What are the major dangers the sources highlight?
The first danger is reducing faith to mere mental assent. Believing that God exists isn't the same as having Abrahamic faith.
Okay.
Remember, Abraham's faith involved personal reliance and obedient movement. True faith isn't just checking a strongly agree box on a theological survey. It is relational, dynamic, and responsive.
Another huge danger they mention, and I think this is the sneakiest one, is treating faith itself as a meritorious work. It's when we subtly turn faith into a new form of self-salvation. It sounds like this. Well, I know I can't earn my way to heaven by being morally perfect, but I can earn it by believing really, really hard. Look how strong my faith is.
Yeah, that is a form of spiritual consumerism or moralism. The paper warns that if you think your act of believing is just the one work you contribute, so God is obligated to reward you, you miss the point of grace entirely.
Right.
Romans 4 explicitly excludes boasting. Faith is the empty hand receiving a gift. The empty hand does not earn the gift.
If we think we have to climb up to God, we fall off the ladder on one of two sides. We either fall into crushing despair when we realize we can't make the climb, or we fall into arrogant pride when we delude ourselves into thinking we succeeded.
Exactly. Justification by faith levels the entire playing field. No one gets to boast.
A third danger they highlight is separating faith from obedience. This is claiming to believe the promise while your life remains completely untouched by God's commands. Abraham leaves his home, he builds altars, he refuses to take plunder from the king of Sodom, and he offers Isaac. As we said before with James, obedience doesn't create the faith, but it absolutely reveals it. A faith that changes nothing in your life is not the faith of Abraham.
The text also warns against confusing the signs with the substance, which we discussed with circumcision. Don't confuse the wedding ring with the marriage vows.
Great point.
And importantly, it warns against making Abraham the ultimate hero of the story. Abraham is honored, yes, he is the father of faith, but the glory belongs entirely to God.
Right.
If we romanticize Abraham as some kind of spiritual entrepreneur who figured it all out, we miss the fact that he was a flawed, doubting man who is justified entirely by grace.
And the final warning from the sources.
Yeah.
Ignoring the Christological fulfillment. You cannot read Abraham's story as just an isolated inspirational tale about a great ancient man. It all points forward to Jesus as the promised seed. Every promise God made Abraham finds its ultimate yes in him.
So to synthesize all of this deep theological mining we've done today, the ultimate takeaway from these sources is that salvation begins entirely with God's initiative.
Yes.
Righteousness is received as a sheer gift, never earned as a wage. And this historical event in Genesis creates a permanent, enduring pattern for all believers. To trust God's promises even, and especially when the fulfillment is entirely unseen.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We started in the dark, rebellious plains of Babel, where humanity desperately tried to build their own legacy.
Yeah.
We traveled to a starlit sky, where a childless, aging nomad was declared righteous simply for opening his empty hands. We stood on the agonizing peak of Mount Moriah, where a father learned that God provides the ultimate substitute.
It's been quite a journey.
We've seen how one man's halting, imperfect, messy faith became the blueprint for the grand narrative of the entire universe.
It is a remarkable, expansive journey. And the profound beauty of unpacking this material is that the sources prove this isn't just ancient, dusty history.
No.
It is the active, living, breathing dynamic of how a human being relates to the Creator right now, today.
Which brings me back to where we started. We talked about what it's like to walk through a pitch-black room with nothing but a flashlight. And as we close, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to carry with you this week.
Let's hear it.
Every single day, whether you realize it or not, you are living by some promise. The world constantly promises you that if you just hustle enough, if you optimize your morning routine enough, if you climb the corporate ladder high enough, you'll finally be secure.
Right.
Modern culture promises that if you hustle to make a name for yourself, exactly like they tried to do thousands of years ago at Babel, you'll finally be satisfied.
But the messy, beautiful life of Abraham asks us a completely different question.
Exactly. What if the only promise actually strong enough to hold the crushing weight of your life, your fears, and your failures is the one promise you cannot possibly earn? the one you can only receive with empty hands. So what promise are you building your life on today?